On this Tuesday night, inside war-torn Kharkiv, the people staying behind in the bombarded city, how they're managing to survive. Plus, wariness over the latest peace talks and Russia's promise to pull back from Kyiv. Canada's latest climate plan, the roadmap to reduce emissions and the billions needed to get there. Signs COVID isn't over in Canada as public health restrictions lift, hospitalizations climb.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There is a lot of caution tonight over promises Russia has made in peace talks with Ukraine. More than a month into its invasion, Russia's deputy defense minister claims it is reducing combat operations around Kyiv and a northern city, saying he wants to increase mutual trust. Negotiators for Russia and Ukraine met face-to-face in Istanbul today, the Turkish president telling them the world is waiting for good news. But Russia has lied and broken past promises, and Western leaders are not taking anything at face value.
I don't read anything into it until I see what their actions are. We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting.
Missiles are still flying and Ukrainians are still dying. This Russian attack today on a southern port city tore a hole through a building. At least 12 people were killed. In just a moment, we'll have more on those peace talks and whether Russian forces are just buying time while regrouping. But we begin with Jeff Semple in Kharkiv, a city that's been under siege for weeks.
Maxim is trying to keep his children distracted from the horrors of their home. 2 weeks ago, they heard an air raid siren and ran down to the basement. It was lucky they did. This is what's left of their apartment building. There was a huge explosion. Everyone was terrified, he says, adding his godmother and 2 of their friends were killed. The family lives in Kharkiv. Ukraine's second largest city has endured the second most Russian attacks, next only to Mariupol. The city is hit by rockets and artillery dozens of times each day. More than 10% of the buildings have been destroyed. Homes, schools, and shopping plazas. It's very scary. We spend most of the time hiding in our basement, this couple says. The city says a third of its 1.5 million residents have fled. Many who've stayed have moved underground. Victoria has spent 3 weeks living in the subway with her husband, daughters, and cats after their home was destroyed. Why is Russia doing this, she asks. Why hurt children? Why hurt old people? Why do we suffer? Many of her extended family members live in Russia. The city is located just 40 kilometers from the Russian border and has long enjoyed close ties with Moscow. We are all Russian speakers in this area, and for some reason we're shelled the most, she says. We met the city's mayor in a secret location. He says his residents have seen the hardships in the Russian-controlled regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russians' mistake was that they thought if 90% of the city speaks Russian, then we will greet them with flowers, he says. They did not realize that the city of Kharkiv was, is, and will be Ukrainian. One of the key pretexts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to protect Russian-speaking communities like this one. Well, this is what Vladimir Putin's protection looks like. This was an apartment building that was shelled just recently, and as you can see, that rubble is still everywhere. The belongings of family members here who were killed in this explosion, children's toys, stuffed animals, clothes, books. It is absolutely horrific. A military press officer took Global News for a tour of the aftermath. We were instructed to follow his car and were far from the front line when we heard gunfire. Warning shots fired into the air by Ukrainian soldiers, whom it turned out hadn't been told by their colleague that we were coming. Yet another example of a city on edge after nearly 5 weeks of relentless attacks. And yet many residents, including Maxim's family, refuse to leave. We were born here and we will die here, he says. Today the bombing is here, tomorrow it's somewhere else. We will not run away from our homeland. We will not give up this city. That's a microphone. His playful 5-year-old daughter Jenna, testing out our microphone, seemed blissfully unaware of the evidence all around them that in this war, no target is off limits. Then another air raid siren, and the family heads for shelter once again. Jeff Semple, Global News, Kharkiv, Ukraine.
There are some signs Russian forces are pulling back from the capital, Kyiv, but the U.S. believes they could be repositioning, not retreating. If the goal was to take the capital city and the whole of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has failed. What his next move is and whether these peace talks in Istanbul are genuine or just a ploy is deeply uncertain. Crystal Gumansingh reports.
An ominous start to peace talks in Istanbul, where Ukraine warned its own negotiators not to eat or drink anything, not even touch any surfaces. A day earlier, it was revealed delegates, including Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, allegedly fell ill due to poisoning. But under that cloud, a glimmer of hope that progress could be made. With NATO member Turkey seated between the two warring nations, Ukraine offered to remain outside of any military alliance and not host foreign military bases. But it wants foreign nations such as Turkey, the U.S., even Canada, to act as security guarantors, signing on to legally protect Ukraine. And it opened the door to negotiations on the future of disrupted territories. The Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed by Russia in 2014, and the contested separatist regions in Donetsk and Luhansk, which Russia recognizes as independent states. But before a deal can move forward, Ukrainians first have to agree. The talks were constructive, says the head of the Russian delegation. We received the Ukrainian side's proposal for consideration. French President Emmanuel Macron has continued to engage in dialogue directly with Vladimir Putin, and he spoke to his counterparts from the UK, Germany, and the US, all agreeing to keep pushing for Russia to fully withdraw its troops. Russian officials said it would radically reduce forces around Kyiv and Chernihiv to facilitate mutual trust. Skeptical American officials say the rollback could also be repositioning.
Russia has failed in its objective of capturing Kyiv. It's failed in its objective of subjugating Ukraine. But they can still inflict massive brutality on the country, including on Kyiv.
This is an example of what Russia is still doing daily all over Ukraine. A missile tore through a government building early Tuesday morning. The deadly attack prompting yet another frantic rescue and recovery effort. It's just a nightmare, she says. A girl died on my floor. While Ukrainians hope for peace, they are still waiting for any sign of it on the ground. It was suggested direct talks between the two leaders could be possible. Crystal Gumansingh, Global News, London.
Ukraine's proposal to adopt neutral status in exchange for security guarantees includes having Canada as one of the countries acting as a security guarantor. It would mean Ukraine would not join any military alliances or host any military bases. Eric Sorensen looks at what that might involve and what it could mean for Canada.
For 7 years, Canadian forces trained thousands of Ukrainian troops. A level of trust and interoperability has been established that puts this country on Ukraine's list of potential security guarantors.
We've been in close contact with our Ukrainian counterparts since the beginning of this crisis.
The Foreign Affairs Minister wouldn't address it, but could a role emerge as negotiators for Ukraine and Russia create some daylight on ceasefire talks? The aim, says this Ukrainian presidential advisor, is to receive security guarantees to stop the conflict. One defense expert sees a possible role for Canada as a peacekeeping nation with relationships among many countries.
Historically, this aligns with Canada's contributions. It is entirely conceivable that Canada will be looking to leverage those relationships to play a possible role as an honest broker and a security guarantor.
Among the possible security guarantor nations named by Ukraine, Turkey and Israel, which have maintained relations with Russia, Poland, the nation that has absorbed the most Ukrainian refugees, and Canada. This country is currently in Latvia, where Canadian forces lead a NATO mission, and Canada's military was on the ground until recently in Ukraine with Operation Unifier, a relationship that is long-standing and deep. As recently as 8 weeks ago, Canada's defense minister was in Kyiv shortly before Canadian military trainers pulled out of Ukraine.
We've trained over 30,000 Ukrainian forces, and they're showing themselves, proving their mettle in the battlefield. So we bring with us all kinds of interoperability skills and alliance links that can be used by Ukraine to increase its security.
A ceasefire is not at hand, but a security force would have to be ready to go quickly.
Canada has a significant experience with Ukrainian bureaucracy and in particular with the Ukrainian defense establishment.
If and when a request comes for Canada to play a role in Ukraine's future security, one source in Ottawa told Global News the government will consider it. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Albertans have begun welcoming Ukrainians fleeing the war. More than 60 people were greeted with cheers and applause as they arrived in Edmonton from Poland last night. Most have family connections in Alberta. The plane they came on is now picking up donated supplies to take back to Ukraine via Poland. The UN Refugee Agency says nearly 4 million people have fled Ukraine since the invasion began. About 6.5 million have been displaced inside the country. UN aid organizations say they've helped up to 900,000 people in Ukraine, but they need to be guaranteed safe passage to do more. Canada is sending more RCMP officers to help the International Criminal Court investigate whether Russia has committed war crimes. The federal government says the officers will use their expertise to collect evidence which may be used in an eventual prosecution. The ICC launched an investigation earlier this month at the request of Canada and 38 other member states. Amnesty International also accuses Russia of committing war crimes, particularly in Mariupol, where about 160,000 civilians have been trapped for weeks with no power and little food. In other news tonight, the Indigenous delegation in Rome toured the Vatican museums today, a day after the first private meetings with Pope Francis to talk about the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system. The museums house the Church's private collection of artwork, archaeology, and historical artifacts. Among them are thousands of culturally significant Indigenous pieces. Some are centuries old and rarely viewed. Indigenous peoples from around the world have requested access to them, including the Métis Nation.
We are going to try to meet with the director of each of the museums that we do tour today and work to find out and start cataloging the items that might actually belong to the Métis Nation.
Private meetings will resume on Thursday, and all the delegates will gather with Pope Francis on Friday. The multi-billion-dollar blueprint to get greener, coming up, Canada's latest plan to slash greenhouse gas emissions. The next federal budget will be delivered on April 7th, and a big part of the focus will be climate change. All previous plans to cut emissions have failed to reach their targets, and today Prime Minister Justin Trudeau laid out the latest one. This plan includes $9.1 billion in new spending and aims to reduce emissions more than 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. As Abigail Beeman reports, that includes a 42% cut to carbon emissions from the oil and gas sector.
This is our boldest and most specific step yet.
The 271-page plan to get to net zero by 2050 looks at each emission-producing sector and offers some solutions. They include mandating 100% of new vehicle sales to be zero-emission cars by 2035, sticking to the carbon tax with an increase to $170 per ton by 2030, and focusing more on electricity, aiming to make it net zero by 2035.
Big oil lobbyists have had their time on the field. Now it's over to the workers and engineers who will build solutions.
Tough talk from the Prime Minister, but no specifics in terms of hard caps on emissions from oil and gas. The plan calls for a 42% emissions reduction by 2030 from the industry, but the government is still exploring how to get there.
They're going to consult, they're going to look down the road. This entire plan is about greenwashing Canada's oil industry.
I would put their feet to the fire. So I would say, we need to see a lot in the next 6 to 12 months.
In addition to oil and gas, this roadmap looks at what kinds of emission cuts are possible by 2030 from all industries. Electricity has the most room to cut, agriculture and transportation the least.
This isn't a fully developed plan at all. It doesn't even pretend to be. This is a fully developed, indicative understanding of what we might do if we had a plan.
They haven't met a single emissions target yet.
Some experts are applauding the plan while calling for more details, especially who is responsible for what, by when, and for what cost.
Two truths can coexist at the same time. This can be at the same time the most transparent and detailed climate plan that Canada has ever seen and still be insufficient.
Officials promise pricing details for the $9.1 billion will come in next week's budget. And while the NDP are critical, their budget support in a confidence vote through the new Liberal NDP deal is not in question. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Stealth Omicron ahead, how Canadians should brace for the latest COVID-19 wave. Public health restrictions have been lifted across much of the country, but the pandemic is not over. Vaccines have certainly saved lives, but in some provinces, hospitalizations for COVID-19 are on the rise again. Jamie Maracher explains what's happening and what we should prepare for.
Just as quickly as masks have come off, health experts are now recommending we put them back on.
It's pretty clear that there's more COVID now than there was a week ago and 2 weeks ago. And we're at the very early parts of a wave.
Cases of the Omicron subvariant BA2, sometimes referred to as stealth Omicron, are rising nationally. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, there's more healthcare workers becoming infected. Wastewater data from Ontario and Alberta has shown an increase in the virus, and over the weekend, COVID hospitalizations started to rise in BC, and that's not the only province.
When you see an increase in the community cases as an indirect measure, you have to be concerned that there will be an increase in hospitalizations. And in fact, at least in Quebec, we are starting to see an increase in the hospitalizations.
Stealth Omicron has been blamed for a tsunami of COVID cases in China, the UK, Germany, and France. But only the latter has recently experienced record hospitalization rates. Another concern is BA2's ability to break through vaccination and reinfect those who've already had COVID. Dr. Alison McGeer says the timing of this wave for older Canadians who are now 4 to 5 months out from their booster is concerning.
Their protection from severe disease will have dropped from somewhere in the 90s, right after their third dose, down to somewhere maybe just below 80%. And while that doesn't sound like a big drop, it's actually a doubling, right?
The US FDA has approved fourth doses for all Americans over 50. In Canada, it's residents of long-term care and immunocompromised adults who are currently eligible.
It's not the answer, but it's part of this multi-layered approach to trying to control cases and obviously control severe illness and death.
An approach we are all too familiar with 2 years in. But it's whether we decide to react with personal protective measures or choose to ignore the warnings, experts say, that will determine the impact of this spring surge. Jamie Maracher, Global News, Toronto.
Everybody on their feet, including the owner, Eugene Melnick.
Businessman Eugene Melnick, owner of the Ottawa Senators, has died. His family and the organization said he passed away after an illness. Melnick bought the Senators in 2003 when the team was facing bankruptcy, and under his tenure, the club made the playoffs 9 times, including a run in the 2007 Stanley Cup final. Melnick was 62 years old. And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with the latest inductee to the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. Deborah Cox, winner of 3 Junos, is the first black woman to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Known for 90s hits like Nobody's Supposed to Be Here, the Toronto-born R&B singer is joining the ranks of Joni Mitchell and the Tragically Hip. She'll receive the honor at the Juno Awards in May. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.